You know, there's one real estate prediction that seems to never get old, and that's another housing crash is coming. I've heard it in the boom markets. I've heard it in the slow markets. Heck, every time the news cycle slows down, you hear it. And part of the reason for this, in my personal opinion, is that thanks to 24-hour nonstop news and social media, people have become desensitized and have more distractions. So the message has to get louder, more extreme, and more sensational just to grab attention. But here's the reality. A housing crash prediction rarely plays out the way people expect. It also ignores major factors like long-term price inflation, population growth, and structural demand. So it's no surprise that every week I have buyers and sellers asking me, should I wait? Should I sell now? Should I be worried? I'm Jeff O'Leary, the Village Guru, and for today, we're cutting through all that hype and looking at what actually is happening in the market through the lens of one thing that never lies, and that's the metric of supply and demand. This video is for buyers, sellers, and investors who want to understand the market objectively and know what to look out for, not just get caught up in the hype headlines. And if you're new here or find this content helpful, drop a comment and let me know what you think is going on with Florida real estate. And as always, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. My contact information is in the description. Now, having said that, let's dive in. Let's start with the number one thing that I believe causes more doubt, anxiety, and uncertainty when it comes to real estate. And that is the negative doom and gloom headlines. Why? Because fear and uncertainty is the easiest way to attract eyeballs, get clicks, and sell advertising. And this is how traditional media outlets and social media content creators make their money. And that's the reality that we live in for pretty much every topic out there. When it comes to real estate, it can leave buyers and sellers wondering, what's the right move? And I can't say I really blame them. We've been trained to believe that the news sources are always impartial and only reporting on the facts. But in reality, they're often spinning a story one way or another. In many cases, the writers come up with a hook that they know will get views, and then they cherry pick the data to support that claim, while ignoring other data that would tell a different story, or at least put it into context so the headline doesn't sound as shocking. Take this example. This article's headline says, Tampa becomes foreclosure epicenter as Florida tops nation in housing distress. At first glance, your reaction probably is, whoa, the epicenter of distress? That's not good. And if you remember 2008, you might get a visceral gut reaction. For some people, this can trigger a lot of negative emotions, maybe even a flight or fight response. If the writer's goal here was to stop the scroll, then a headline like this works perfectly. Now let's say after reading this, you go back to social media. Because of the algorithm, you start seeing more of the same content. For example, here we have a YouTube video with a Florida city backdrop, beautiful palm trees, a distressed woman getting kicked out of her house by what looks like FBI agents, and the title, Foreclosures Explode. Or another post, don't move here. Tampa becomes the foreclosure epicenter as Florida tops nation in housing distress. There's that word again, epicenter. And finally, here's a post that mixes fear with politics. The highest level of home foreclosure in the U.S. is in Florida, higher than New York, higher than California. MAGA folks are literally trash-talking liberal states while in court fighting to stay in their own homes. Now, as a side note, if you get joy out of the last example, share it, and think your team is winning, it might be time to reevaluate your priorities and worldview. But regardless, the point I'm trying to make here is how easily clickbait headlines reinforced by social media can create a narrative that might not be 100% accurate. So let's get back to the original article and look at it more objectively. If we scroll down, we find the actual data point. 1 in every 1,373 housing units in Tampa had a foreclosure filing in October. Okay, so now we have the data. Let's compare this with what actually happened in a real housing crisis in 2008. In 2008, Florida's foreclosure rate was about 1 in 22 homes that received at least one foreclosure filing that year. So statewide back then, things were roughly 80 times worse than what this recent article is reporting. There's absolutely no comparison between 2008 and today, even though for many people, these headlines do bring back those same memories and emotions. Now let's take it one step further. What the headlines also fail to communicate is that recently the Tampa Bay area was hit by major hurricanes like Helene and Milton, which the National Weather Service describes as two of the most impactful storms on Florida's west coast in the last 100 years. So as an investor, Here are the questions that I would be asking. Were homes damaged and destroyed? Yes, thousands. Did some owners lose their home because they can't afford to rebuild? Unfortunately, yes, they did. Is this causing insurance rate hikes in the most risky areas? Yes, it is. Were all the areas of Florida affected the same way? Absolutely not. So in conclusion, my heart does go out to all those affected by the storms. But when you combine the fact that this is not 2008 with the reality that we experienced a rare, high-impact storm in certain coastal areas, it becomes clear that the narrative is not black and white, and it might not be nearly as bad for most areas as the headline implies. If you take only one thing away from this video, it's this. Real estate doesn't crash because a TikTok says it does. It moves because of supply and demand. That's it. So let's break down what supply and demand really means for you. It's simpler than the hype, but far more powerful. When it comes to supply and demand, here are the basics. Supply equals the number of homes available for sale, and demand equals how many buyers are in the market. It's that simple. But here's the catch. With a lot of statistics, whether national or local, there's usually an average of a wide range of homes in very different communities. When it comes to residential real estate, keep these 2 points in mind when looking at supply and demand statistics. First is that real estate is local. So for example, in New York, the market might be going up, while at the same time in California, it might be going down. And even within the same state, one city might see bidding wars while another is in a slump. Be sure that the information you're looking at applies to your local market. Second, even within one market, you can see different realities. For example, in Sarasota, where I live, the condo market is very different from the single-family home segment. Right now, condos are generally selling slower, same market, different conditions. With that in mind, a great metric to understand supply and demand in a market is called the absorption rate, also known as months worth of inventory. Here's an example of how absorption rate is calculated. Last month, if you had 10 homes for sale in your market and 2 sold, you take 10 divided by 2 and that equals 5. So in this example, we would say that the market has 5 months worth of supply. Now here's the rule of thumb for understanding absorption rate. Under 4 months of supply is considered a seller's market, which means less inventory is available, and that puts upward pressure on prices. Around 4 to 6 months is a balanced market. No major advantage to either buyers or sellers. And finally, when you get over 7 months of supply, that's what the industry calls a buyer's market, where prices tend to soften as sellers compete with each other to get a sale. Being able to calculate and understand absorption rate is a great tool to tell you what has happened and what the trend is looking like in the near future. This helps you when negotiating and also coming up with the best strategy, whether you're a buyer or a seller. So you might be thinking at this point, this is good to know, but I'm not ready to buy or sell right now. What will the market be like in the future when I am ready? And that's a good question. And while no one has a crystal ball, this is where serious investors and analysts start looking at what influences supply and demand. When it comes to supply and demand, think of them like 2 sides of the same coin. First, let's look at the supply side. Factors that influence supply in the medium to long term include the number of homes for sale and what's the trend. Is it going up? Is it going down? The number of new listings entering the market also trending up or down? What's the forecast for new construction completions, which will add more supply to the market? And finally, what's the average days on market to sell a home and the actual sold to ask ratio? As a seller, these stats tell you how long you should reasonably expect it to take to sell if you price your home properly. As a buyer, they give you an idea of how much room there might be for negotiation. Depending on what all these trends are showing, you can make an educated guess on what will likely happen to supply and demand in the near future. Now let's talk about demand. Factors that influence demand include population growth. Is the area growing or is it stagnating? Job growth. Are there new employers moving in? How's the local economy doing? Net migration, especially in a state like Florida, where more people move to the state than leave. You'll also want to ask yourself, what's the level of business investment into the local community? Are you seeing new stores, restaurants, roads, and infrastructure? Businesses tend to invest where they expect growth. Also, be sure to keep an eye on the local news and events. For example, after a hurricane, it's reasonable to expect slower demand in the short term, but it can also bring in long-term rebuilding and infrastructure investment. Then we have national factors to take into consideration, such as interest rates. Are they going up Are they going down? And then we have consumer confidence. Are people optimistic or are they pessimistic? And what about the stock market and the broader economic conditions, which are especially important for luxury and cash buyers? Studying these factors helps you understand the long-term prospects for demand in an area instead of relying on shallow headlines. So here's the key thing I want you to take away about supply and demand. You can't predict the short term perfectly, nobody can, but over the medium to long term, the signals become much clearer. Now that we know how to research supply and demand, let's move on to what the headlines are actually saying versus what's actually happening in today's market. Here's the mismatch we're seeing in Florida. What the headlines say: a crash is imminent. Everybody should wait. Prices are about to plunge. Why is that? Because soundbite headlines and social media influencers know this works. Studies show that negative words and headlines significantly increase clicks, shares, which encourages more negative content, which creates a never-ending cycle where everybody is chasing attention. Now let's shift to what's actually happening. First, there's no broad-based crash like in 2008. In some markets, prices have flattened. In others, they've come down a bit. But a lot of that is simply a reaction to the insane run-ups that we saw during COVID. Long-term demand remains strong, particularly in Florida. People continue to move here, and investors and business are still putting money into the area. So what then is causing the confusion around Florida real estate? For starters, interest rates remain high, and many people who would have otherwise moved are delaying this because they're locked into a very low rate at 3% or less. This is called the lock-in effect, and it's very real. Also, it's no secret that national public sentiment is very negative right now. A lot of it driven by politics and non-stop negative news. Also in Florida, seasonality does cause natural slowdowns. And finally, what a lot of people don't realize is that local markets behave differently. For example, what happens in Orlando might not be happening in Sarasota. As I like to say, markets don't move in a straight line. They breathe. And right now, Florida is exhaling after years of insanity, not collapsing. So if you're waiting for the perfect moment or the big crash, you might miss a real opportunity here. Now let's focus on why Florida real estate still remains a great option. So why does Florida stand apart? Because of a set of unique structural advantages, including population and migration. People are still moving here in large numbers from higher tax, higher cost states. Next, we have limited land, especially in Sarasota and Lakewood Ranch, which limits future supply. Builders can't fully keep up. Even though there's a lot of building, demand remains strong, and there is still a measurable housing shortage in many Florida cities. And then we have no state income tax. That draws lifestyle buyers, retirees, and investors. And we can't forget about retiree demand. Florida is consistently one of the top states to retire in the U.S. And last but not least, we have a large cash buyer pool. Many out-of-state buyers pay cash or make very large down payments, especially in the higher price points. It's this combination that creates what I like to call structural demand, and it isn't a one-year fad. Think about it. Unless someone figures out how to build 100,000 homes overnight, supply isn't going to magically catch up. So to finish it off, let's move on to what all this means for you if you're buying or selling a home. If you're a buyer, here's what you should know. Don't wait for a mythical crash. Waiting might get you a slightly better rate, but you also might pay more for the home. Focus on the right community and the right price. The zip code and the lifestyle matter just as much as the house itself. Next, leverage seasonal opportunities. Some builders and sellers offer more incentives in the slower months. Also keep in mind that builders are offering significant incentives right now in many Florida communities: closing costs, rate buy downs, design credits. Use that to your advantage. Also, don't chase the perfect mortgage rate. Instead, date the rate, marry the house. Rates move, you can always refinance, but you can't go back in time and get last year's price. And finally, have a plan before you start looking at homes. Narrow down your ideal community, get pre-approved, and get clear on your budget, and define your must-haves and deal breakers. Armed with basic understanding of supply and demand, you'll be far more strategic. Now, if you're a seller, listen up. Buyers have more options now. Presentation matters more than ever. Incorrect pricing equals stagnation. You might think you can test the market, but that usually costs you time and ultimately money. Remember, you're also competing against new construction. Your home must either show better or be priced smarter. And finally, don't forget about staging and presentation. Buyers in Florida are buying a lifestyle, not just the bricks and mortar. And also don't forget, the COVID overpricing effect is gone. Homes that are still priced like it's 2022 are facing resistance. Smart pricing wins now. You want to sell fast and strong. You want to make sure that buyers know about the improvements you have, and you want to show your home at your best, and you want the best marketing strategy possible. So having said that, now let's pull it all together with a reality check. Here's the real truth I know from doing real estate for close to 18 years. Hype comes and it goes, fear spikes, headlines swing, but supply and demand, that's the real driver. Demand for Florida living, the warm weather, low taxes, and great lifestyle isn't going away anytime soon. And unless someone builds 100,000 homes overnight, supply isn't going to suddenly catch up. So instead of chasing headlines or waiting forever, it's about being ready, knowing the fundamentals, and making smart moves. If you want help navigating your next move in this market, reach out. I'll walk you through exactly what you need to know so you don't make the mistakes I see every day with buyers and sellers who aren't armed with the right information. Whether you're buying or selling, we'll map out a strategy together. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, hit the like button, subscribe, and share this with anyone who's thinking about making a move. And as always, if you have any questions or want to work together, my contact info is in the description. I'm Jeff O'Leary, the Village Guru. Let's get you moving.